This week on the Wheelhouse, voter trends, cabinet picks, and a look ahead at the next 4 years. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. 2 weeks ago, voters across Connecticut hit the polls. The votes have been counted, the results announced. And now that the dust has settled, what do we know about what some are calling a red wave? This hour will move from updates on the new tabulators to blue Connecticut's shift toward red. Later in the show, Ace reporters Ebon Gudama, John Moritz, and Alex Putterman will be on the show with me. Joining me now, though, Jim Huddadine. And what a man he is, investigative editor for the Accountability Project here at Connecticut Public. Jim, great to have you on here today.
Thank you, Frankie. Great to be with you.
Great to have you on as well. Also with us, Maysoon Khan, investigative reporter for the Accountability Project at CT Public. Just joined the Accountability Project recently, already making her mark. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you on. And listeners, if you want to share a story about your voting experience, maybe you were one of those flip voters, maybe you voted for Biden 4 years ago and this time you voted for Trump, something like that, give us a call. We want to talk to you. Don't be shy. Give us a call today. 888-720-9677. Maysoon, you're going to get the first question here. I want to start with the tabulators. $25 million, right? It's this new batch of funding that came in to support democracy in Connecticut. And these machines actually run their ballots through after they've filled in all the ballots. Pilot program, to try out the new machines, right? How did that go?
So the pilot program went pretty well. Very little hiccups that we know of, just kind of one reported issue in one town, which we'll get to later. But this was, again, as you said, part of a pilot program. So 9 towns/cities in Connecticut got these new tabulators. And they're ES&S machines. And ES&S, if anyone knows, they're kind of they're up there in terms of providing election equipment to, various states in the country. And so it's part of the state's effort to upgrade its aging election equipment, which we'll also talk about in a bit. But they got about 2,700 tabulators. All in all, went well. No complaints.
What do they look like compared to the old machines?
So these new machines, they kind of have a larger screen. So with people who might have issues with their sight, and I'm one of those people, it's pretty great. It makes the letters are a bit bigger, so you're able to kind of see, once you put your paper ballot in, you're able to kind of see all the inputs that you had. There is also kind of a pop-up screen that comes up if there's issues with your ballot. So if you, for example, selected 2 presidential candidates instead of 1, it'll flag that as an issue. So it runs a bit more efficiently than the older machines and a bit more accurately as well.
So we have maybe more of a touchscreen kind of situation, whereas maybe you had one of those like large Epsom printers or something like that from back in the day that you feed the ballots through. It seems like a more intuitive process this time around.
Yep.
You got a chance to talk to the Republican Registrar of Voters in Rocky Hill, Connecticut about the old machines. We're going to take a listen, actually, to what he had to say.
We're very fortunate to become one of the towns because we needed the new voting machines. Our old voting machines they predate me by a long time.
Tom Buglese saying that these machines were old. Mm-hmm. And obviously they needed some new tabulators. What did you get from your conversation with Tom?
So I think for the viewers especially, it's so important, the listeners, a lot of the voting machines that are used in Connecticut now are actually approaching 2 decades. And so a lot of the towns that we even saw some issues with the tabulators or voting machines that are old, they kind of run into a bit more hiccups. Sometimes the issues are harder to mend. So there was a kind of a dire need for new voting machines to just kind of make Election Day a lot more smooth and fluid. And so that's exactly what Tom and I spoke about. It's these The old machines, there was a dire need to bring in the new ones, and so far it's went pretty well. There's a plan to bring the rest of the new voting machines to the rest of the state by the summertime of 2025 for the midterm elections. And so that's kind of the new project that the state's kind of working on to kind of implement this statewide and, get rid of all the old machines.
So a bit of a slower rollout, as we saw with early voting and some of the other things that Connecticut is trying to do to support democracy. And speaking of democracy, Jim, I know you know a little bit about our survey that we did of listeners this year. You were very supportive to that effort. Thank you so much, Jim. Jim works with our accountability project, and he was helping us understand what maybe the top issues that listeners had on their minds were when we got all these results, and you kind of have to disaggregate all that data that we get. Because we had over 750 responses. Thank you all for your support. But one common response we heard from people was that they were worried about the state of democracy. Democracy at work during voting days, even with the minor hiccups that we had on Election Day that we'll kind of talk more about. Did the democratic process work well here in Connecticut? I know that's a big kind of question, but what do you got for me? That's a big J question as well.
Sure. Well, I do want to say thank you to all of our listeners, our viewers who did fill out that election survey. We really got a robust response. And I did spend a lot of time going over those answers. And certainly I could see that, concern about democracy and about the future of the country was a prevailing theme there. So that really helped us inform our coverage this season. So we appreciate everyone who did participate. In terms of, what happened with democracy this time around, I think if you ask the Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas, I think she would enthusiastically tell you that democracy did work in Connecticut. She was out there as soon as the polls closed on Election Day. To say, we've got no major issues. I think what we saw around the state was what we kind of typically see in Connecticut. Occasionally some places with some long lines that bubble up during the presidential election, some hiccups with these older voting machines. But at the end of the day, things went pretty smoothly. I'll say voters also approved a ballot measure to potentially expand access to absentee ballot voting in the future. And so from that standpoint, you could look at this election and say, we really paved a way for more engagement with the democratic process in the future.
Looking on your screen, you could see some of these new tabulators, and you could see democracy at work there. Jim mentioned that some of the issues that happened were with old machines. Were there recounts in any towns across the state? Recounts, excuse me.
Yeah, we did. We'd had a couple of recounts in Torrington in the 65th House District. The race between Democratic incumbent Michelle Cook and Republican Joe Canino. That race did go to a recount, and Joe Canino came out on top. I think the unofficial results is something like 56 ballots in his favor. So I think things will be finalized soon in that race, but it looks like he is the winner in that race. Also, as a quirk or kind of an offshoot of that, that recount brought a Senate race that Torrington is part of within the margin where an automatic recount is necessary. And so we've had a recount taking place in 11 cities and towns that are part of that 8th Senate district. That is a race between Democrat and challenger Paul Honig against Republican Lisa Seminara. And so it looks like Honig's ahead in that race. I think as of last night, towns were doing the recount in that one. So that was the other race that had gone to a recount. But that was kind of a consequential race. Honig's victory was the sole flip in the state Senate. So it kind of helps the Democratic majority there kind of entrench itself a little more deeply if he takes that seat.
Jim mentioned the race in the 65th. I have to share a transparency note with you. I'm related to the Republican candidate who won, Joe Canino, so we won't be diving further into that race today. You've been crunching some numbers based on how towns throughout Connecticut voted this year. What have you found?
So I think a lot of us have been looking at these election maps that came out after the presidential election and looking nationwide at what looks like a pretty significant rightward shift in the electorate. And I think we saw that here in Connecticut as well. If you measure how towns voted in 2020 and how they voted in 2024, we see, statewide, a shift of about 5 percentage points toward Trump's favor. That played out in a huge swath of individual communities, too, of different types, big cities, smaller communities. We saw a similar shift toward Trump. Trump had maintained his support in big swaths of New London County and Windham County on the eastern side of the state and in Litchfield County to the west. People came out to vote for him in 2020 in those parts of the state, and they came back again this year. And similarly, Democrats were strong in their traditional strongholds around Greater Hartford, the big cities, the shoreline. But even in those communities, you did see a higher percentage turnout for Trump this time around. And Trump flipped 14 towns in Connecticut that had, the majority of people had come out to support President Biden in 2020. And this time around, we saw those places voting for President Trump.
Not super huge margins, and I think we're going to get this with our panel later. Trump got 20,000 more votes. This is according to unofficial results. And Jim, you could tell me if I'm wrong here, but this is unofficial results and doing the math. He got, I think, 20,000 more votes than he did 4 years ago in Connecticut, and he still got a closer percentage, as you said, 5 percentage points, I think, difference as compared to last time.
Yeah, I think I was looking at it this morning. I think he brought in about 22,000 additional votes.
22,000.
Yeah, about 22,000 this year. I will say, the thing to keep in mind here is we're talking about a change in the turnout in the state. So, one way to think about this is that indeed, Trump did improve his standing in Connecticut and a lot of other places. But at the same time, we have another kind of variable changing in this equation, and that is turnout. We did not have as many people come out to vote in Connecticut this year. So what you're talking about is a smaller pie, a smaller group of votes. So while Trump's percentage is reflected as seeing these increases, what you actually have is kind of a lot fewer people coming out to vote. And then within that, some group of people who had voted for Biden in 2020 coming back to vote for Trump. So he definitely did have some gains this time around, but I think what we're seeing is just a smaller pool of people turning out, and that's why that increase looks kind of substantial that way.
Before I underscore Jim's point, take a look at the screen. Look at those beautiful graphics created by Sam Hockaday, Julianne Veracci, and the visuals team here at Connecticut Public. Man, the Wheelhouse is so supported. We've got Jim and team here with Maysoon Khan supporting us with the Accountability Project and these great visuals that are putting together the story of how Trump did in Connecticut in 2024 versus 2020. Turnout, as Jim mentioned, was smaller this time around. About 5 percentage points, something like that smaller. I think it was 80% in the 2020 election and about 75% this time around. And Jim and I won't necessarily get into the reasons, I guess, for why that was right now. But a lot of people want to say that has something to do with COVID. But you did have early voting this time around, which was popular. But last time around, you had the opportunity to get a no-excuse ballot because of COVID as well. So interesting over the next few months to kind of track all of these kind of things. And please be sure to stick with the Wheelhouse and visit ctpublic.org/wheelhouse as we help you unpack the results of the 2024 election. Was there anything in these findings that, I don't want to say you were surprised by, but something that made you want to dig deeper into it or inspired you to make this this great discovery that you did?
Well, I think a trend that we've been following for a couple of years is what we were just talking about, this kind of drop in turnout, particularly in some of Connecticut's urban areas in the big cities. We saw this in the midterm election in 22. We did the same analysis and published a story then showing that some of the cities were really an area of concern for Democrats in Connecticut. And I think you saw that again this time. In Bridgeport, for example, I think you saw something like 5,000 fewer people coming out to vote this time. And to your point around the registrations actually look pretty similar this year as they did last time. So, in terms of people who are in position to vote, you have kind of the same pool of people and you just have fewer people coming out this time. So I think that really is a question that folks will be thinking about over the next couple of years is kind of what has happened in Connecticut's big cities. Beyond that, I think election officials were a little surprised by the process of counting votes. I think something about the combination of a lot of people coming out early to vote and then a lot of same-day registration turned the vote counting into a little bit of a longer process than I think people were expecting this time around. And I think we're all kind of learning what it means to have early voting in play that way.
Yeah, same-day registration, as you'll see often, if you're following on election night, you'll see lines develop in places like New Haven and Bridgeport as people are taking advantage of same-day registration. Nationally, we heard stories of Avengers characters showing up to the ballot, to the polling locations to try to keep people in line. So same-day registration, another thing that we'll be following. But it's just such as Jim mentioned, it's kind of a interesting sort of paradoxical election in the fact that, I don't know if paradoxical is a word, whatever, but it's just a hard election to understand because a lot of thought that pundits and people that commentate on these things like me and other journalists in the state of Connecticut were thinking was that specifically in the 5th district, you were going to have a bigger turnout this time around because it was a presidential election. And that didn't necessarily happen, yet Jahana Hayes still won by a wider margin than she did 2 years ago. So it's just a hard election to understand, and that's why I think it's going to be incumbent upon the Wheelhouse and reporters at Connecticut Public to keep telling the story, Jim, over the next couple of months.
Yeah, we'll be following it along.
We keep talking about this shift to the right here in Connecticut. Maysoon, as part of your reporting last week, you spoke with Ben Proto, chairman of the Republican Party in Connecticut. Let's listen to what he had to say.
If Trump can do what he says he wants to do, if he can get the economy under control, if he can get pricing under control, if he can make groceries affordable, if he can make everyday American lives more affordable, if he can help ensure the future of our children and our grandchildren, if he can help seal the border, if he can do the things he's been talking about doing as we move into the 2026 cycle, the midterm cycle, I think it will be very beneficial for Republicans here in Connecticut.
Obviously, a lot to be excited about for Ben Proto right now as the establishment, at least in terms of Democrats controlling the United States Senate, the presidency. Maybe there was thoughts that they would make a little more ground in the House races. Everything's kind of been flipped, turned upside down, as Will Smith might say, Maysoon. Things are kind of changing in America, and I think that's kind of what Ben Proto is illustrating. Exactly.
So when we're talking about the, Donald Trump's win for the presidential election and the impact on the state level, there isn't a huge impact just on the local level. If we're talking about the Connecticut state legislature, even Republican lawmakers in the state legislature, there isn't a huge impact. But as you heard Ben Proto say, and even top Republicans in the state legislature, they're kind of making the point that this can really help them in the midterm election coming up in 2026, particularly Trump policies. Again, you heard kind of Ben Proto illustrate that, if Trump is able to keep his promises, that could seriously help Republicans in the state level make inroads in state government, in local races. And so that's kind of what they're kind of focused on. And so I think, that it makes a point to say that we're going to be turning our eyes to the midterm elections coming up and seeing how, this pans out.
Those Senate seats that we were watching in Fairfield County didn't flip. We did see what something happen in Torrington, where we had a candidate that was around for, I think, 8 terms or something like that, lost. And then, of course, you're talking about the national situation. And Jim didn't exactly say this, but you had voter turnout down. He did say that, but maybe it can allude to apathy a little bit. So there's a lot of things to be concerned about if you're a Democrat, and it doesn't sound like Ben Proto has a lot of concerns these days, as I imagine he was very happy with the results. Is there anything else you want to share or maybe allude to in your reporting that you got coming up? What do you got, guys? Give me something here. What's TAP working on? Anything you could tell us?
I will say, I'm very excited. We've Maysoon and I have been working closely with our healthcare reporter, Sujata Srinivasan, on a couple of projects where we're trying to kind of merge our complementary skills, working on the FOIA requests, the investigative research, and partnering with the great knowledge and sources that she has in the health world here in Connecticut. So we have a couple of pieces that we're excited about that are in production now. Obviously, we'll be able to say a little bit more about that as they come down the line, but I'd say take a look in the next couple of months for some healthcare reporting from us.
A foreshadowing, if you will. You can see an interview I did with Sujata last week that humanized gun violence and really focused on how the discourse impacts survivors at ctpublic.org, which is also the same place that you're going to find the great work that Jim, Maysoon, and Sujata are going to do together, and some of the other TAP colleagues that you have. We are so excited for that work that comes along. And welcome to the Wheelhouse, Maysoon Khan. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Frankie.
Jim, thank you for coming on, and thank you for supporting our survey this year. We appreciate
it was a
much.
Pleasure. A lot of fun.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You've been listening to Jim Huddadine, investigative editor for the Accountability Project. And you've also heard Maysoon Khan, who's just joined the Accountability Project at Connecticut Public. Connecticut, a blue state, but that doesn't mean that Republican President Donald Trump's policies won't impact us here. That's coming up after the break. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Make those phone lines glow, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, we're unpacking the why behind the trend of more voters leaning red than usually they do here in the blue state of Connecticut. We'll hear more on that. Plus, look ahead at how Donald Trump's presidency will impact people across the state. Joining me now, excited to hear from him, Ebong Udama, senior political reporter for WSHU. Ebong, thanks you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Frankie. How are you?
Good to see you again over Zoom here. I love your setup.
Thank you.
Also with us, John Moore, state reporter for Connecticut Insider and Hearst Connecticut Media. John, it's great to have you on with us today.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Good to see you this morning. And also Alex Putterman, reporter at Connecticut Insider, CT Insider, and Hearst Connecticut Media. Alex, so good to talk to you as well.
Great to be here, Frankie.
If you got a question or comment about how Donald Trump's presidency might impact you, join the conversation. Still looking to hear maybe from somebody who voted for Donald Trump in this election. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. Just want to know if you all were able to get a chance to listen to the last interview and had any response to what you heard from Connecticut Public investigative reporters Maysoon Khan and Jim Huddadine. Alex, have you had a chance to speak with voters since the election?
Yeah, I thought the first segment summed up the trends very well. And yes, I have. Our whole team went out to some sort of key towns and cities in Connecticut and spoke with voters. And, we heard a lot of what you would expect to hear. Connecticut is a blue town. We certainly heard from Harris voters. We also heard from Trump voters. We heard from people who, I think this was maybe most telling in my experience, talking to a guy who voted for Harris, is glad he voted for Harris, Democrat, no doubt. But he said, I get why Trump appealed to people in this election, even in Connecticut, even in Hartford, where we happen to be. He felt that Trump was a little bit more relatable. He used the term more down to earth. And again, this is a guy who voted for Harris and was disappointed that she lost. But it didn't seem like people necessarily were shocked. I think, Trump has an appeal. And even if not everybody understands it 100%, there's no denying it.
Alex, I did say that there is a trend where more people are voting red in Connecticut. 22,000 was the number I think we had more votes for Donald Trump than there were 4 years ago. But you see Jahana Hayes got a little more support in the 5th district than she did this time around 2 years ago. It seems like there was a lower turnout, I think by 5 percentage points or something like that. Is it that more people are voting red in Connecticut, or are less people coming out? Maybe it's a little bit of both. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely a little bit of both. I would say what you mentioned with Jahana Hayes was kind of a national trend where Democrats a little bit down ballot did well. Democratic senators won in states where Trump won. On the other hand, in the presidential race, I think you're right. It was a combination of a little bit more support for Trump and then also people staying home. I also talked to people in Hartford who didn't bother to vote because they just, don't feel like the candidates are speaking to them. Or, in particular, I think in some circles, Kamala Harris was a really exciting candidate that got people, ready to volunteer and donate money. And then in other circles, they didn't really get the appeal or didn't feel like she was speaking to them. So I think it was definitely some of both.
Some voters turned to Donald Trump 8 years ago when there was that talk of drain the swamp. And this time around, I would imagine, as Alex is mentioning, they see Trump as this kind of change maker, whether or not it's for the good or not. But we want to get into that a little more in a little bit. But first, let's hear from Tim from Willimantic. Tim, go ahead. I want to hear from you and what you got to say this morning. Thank you for calling into the Wheelhouse.
Well, I just wanted to tell you that I went all Democrat, all across the line. I was told I couldn't put Pamela Harris's name in on the ballot. I was like, what? Well, they came back and they said, no, you can't. Just put a Democrat and we'll put it in for you. I was like, oh, yeah? Well, that being said, I have another friend of mine who lives over in Mantic, and he also did put in Pamela Harris's name, too.
So you voted for Kamala Harris. You didn't vote for Donald Trump. So if people are mad in America about the results, they can't blame Tim from Willimantic, is what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely not.
How are you doing in Donald Trump's America here as we move on here and he's the president-elect? How are you doing today?
not good at all. When I just heard that he's going to hire the lady that runs the WWE, friggin'
Linda
hire
McMahon.
her as McMahon, yeah, as a friggin' education lady. She has nothing to do with education. She was in the board of education for a little while before she went to turn to go run for a senator. That's the only experience she has.
Tim, thank you so much for calling us this morning. It was so good to talk to you and hear from you. Linda McMahon, 4 years ago, John Moritz, was finishing up her run in the Small Business Administration in a Donald Trump cabinet, and it sounds like she's going to be back, at least preliminarily. So Tim from Willimantic, shocked by that appointment. Anything you want to react to from what you just heard from Tim, or at least when Donald Trump assumes his presidency in January, he says he's going to fulfill the promises he's made. Remind us maybe of what some of those promises are.
Well, he certainly made a lot of promises throughout the long campaign. Probably the biggest one that sticks on most people's mind. The first thing people think of when they think of his campaign is his promise for mass deportations. And that was something that he repeated both on the campaign trail, but was also actually written into the Republican Party policy platform that was adopted at the GOP convention in Milwaukee this summer. Looking at Connecticut, he's promised to repeal the Biden administration's electric vehicle mandates, which, if you've read our reporting in the last year, Connecticut has reverted to following rather than some stricter mandates out of California. So if he follows through on that, that'll certainly be an impact in Connecticut. And then, he's like all candidates, he spoke a lot about taxes. In his first administration, he passed a round of tax cuts that are set to expire next year. So, whoever won the last election was going to have to deal with a big tax debate in Washington next summer. And that's certainly something that he and Congress will be looking at.
I'm trying not to rub my hands together here because it's going to look like I'm a gentleman that wants the world to burn or something like that. But we talk about this major kind of paradigm shift in the country or major change at work. If we have mass deportations, at least the way that our economy has worked, we had Charles Venator Santiago on a couple of weeks ago here talking about the impact that Latinos, talking about the impact that undocumented immigrants have on the economy. And if some of these folks that are undocumented return back to a different country and leave America, then you would see an economy maybe, especially one that relies on the work of some of these undocumented immigrants, maybe even collapse. And then when you're talking about taxes, we're not sure what the IRS is going to look like under Donald Trump. So are these some of the same concerns that you're hearing about if we have mass deportation or if we have changes at these federal agencies? What are your thoughts here, John?
Well, you asked about talking to voters, and as my colleague Alex said, we were out last week chatting with people, and then the week before that, I talked with many Republican voters at the polls, and pretty much to a person, every Republican voter that I spoke to in the last couple of weeks raised either the issue of immigration or the economy. So I think that's certainly top on people's minds, and for Donald Trump's voters, that's a promise that they're going to be looking for him to fulfill in the next 4 years. My colleague, Natasha Sokoloff, knows a little bit more about this. She reported recently that Connecticut has about 110,000 undocumented workers. So the plan that whatever he puts in place is certainly going to have an impact, not just throughout the country, but here in Connecticut.
Just recently followed the reporting of CBS News' John Dickerson saying that the bond markets in America concerned about immigration, and that's why you're seeing some of those futures markets struggling a little bit as we look toward a potential 4 more years. Actually, it's coming with Donald Trump here in America. Alex, we live in a majority Democrat state. And when I say that, I mean there are almost double the number of active voters affiliated with the Democratic Party than are Republican Party members in Connecticut. And the congressional delegation is all D, no R's. But that doesn't mean that people here aren't impacted by a Republican president. Given what we just heard from John, what do you anticipate a second Donald Trump presidency will mean for people in Connecticut?
Yeah, I mean, there, will be many impacts. And, some are obviously hard to anticipate, is the Trump administration really going to impose large tariffs that could potentially increase prices on imported goods? We'll kind of have to wait and see. I think a big story of the next 4 years in Connecticut is going to be sort of the push and pull between state and local officials here in Connecticut, and then the federal government. Already, our governor and our congressional delegation have kind of come out firing, saying, on an issue like deportations, we have a law in Connecticut that says that state and local law enforcement cannot cooperate with ICE in deporting undocumented immigrants. And so, Attorney General William Tong has said, we're going to enforce that law. The ACLU has called on the state to even tighten that law further, to make sure there is no circumstance under which local or state law enforcement would cooperate with ICE in deportations. Similarly, a big part of the Trump campaign's message concerned transgender rights, and they sort of vilified transgender people in certain ways. Those ads about sex changes for people in prison, and a lot of talk about transgender athletes in sports. What's going to happen with that if they change certain federal regulations? In the state, there will probably be an effort to protect trans rights to whatever extent possible. But that kind of push and pull, and what can the federal government do and what can the state government prevent, I think is going to be a big story.
Alex, let's stay here for a second on that point that you just made. A lot of folks that were thinking about the results and weren't exactly happy with what happened. They maybe wanted Kamala Harris to defeat Donald Trump for president, maybe trying to cope with the results afterward, telling folks that maybe it'll be fine. They'd already made it through 4 years of a Trump administration. For certain folks, it won't necessarily be fine. And why I think about that is because of what you just mentioned. I watch a lot of football, big San Francisco 49ers fan. Every time I'm watching the games, I'm seeing jokes about he, she, them pronouns and things like that, as you just mentioned in those ads, and talking about sex change operations and vilifying those, as you mentioned, as well. So there are certainly people in this country that aren't going to be fine, including maybe athletes from Connecticut that choose to identify to a different gender to which they were at birth, as we saw with that lawsuit that was very popular among, or I should say infamous among the Trump administration 4 years ago, with Betsy DeVos and the Department of Education threatening to take money away from the state of Connecticut for their rules.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good example of, if it were up to the Trump administration, I think that transgender girls would probably not be permitted to play girls' sports as they are in Connecticut. They have also talked about, other things about cutting funding for schools that teach what, quote unquote, transgender insanity. They've talked about outlawing gender affirming care for minors. I think a lot of that will be difficult. I mean, we still have a separation between, state powers and federal powers. And I think ultimately, it would be hard for the Trump administration to unilaterally, tell states what to do in some of these areas. However, to your point, I think this is going to be an issue we hear about a lot. And I don't think, regardless of what the policy outcomes wind up being, I could imagine it not being fun for a lot of transgender people to have to sort of like live through sort of the politicization and debate about sort of their very existence. I think even in a psychological sense, it could be a very difficult 4 years.
And we've already seen at the federal level here, at least a rules change that was trying to be made here ahead of the advent of Sarah McBride, who's going to be the first transgender member of Congress to join her chamber. I'm going to fire a couple of questions here at Ebong before we end the segment. Ebong, before I ask you about something that's happening in Connecticut to protect folks against potential national restrictions, I want to just kind of toss at you what we were talking about with tariffs and maybe something that became too hard for the Biden administration to manage. We are certainly looking that because of the way the tariffs are, because of some of the policies in the prior Trump administration, it looks like inflation, at least experts are predicting that inflation will go back up. And it certainly seemed like it was going down under Biden, but the messaging didn't hit Americans well, maybe. Maybe they thought that the administration wasn't necessarily giving them the message the right way. Maybe it was bedside manner, whatever it was. They weren't understanding that inflation was going down. What is your take on all of that?
I paid particular attention to what Proto said, the GOP chair, what he had to say about what he's expecting. And I noticed that he talked about bringing higher prices under control, and he also talked about controlling the border. But he didn't mention mass deportation, neither did he mention tariffs. So I think there's a feeling that these are not going to be good for the economy. And so a lot of people try to stay away from that and just say, well, he's going to make everything good. But if you go into the details of what is being proposed, economy, there's no economist that says that this will be good for the economy in the long run. And that's one of the reasons why the bond market has been down ever since the election 2 weeks ago.
Many groups across the state have mobilized since Trump's victory, obviously, and you kind of heard Alex Putterman hint at that, at least regarding the ACLU and immigration. Another front, reproductive rights, Connecticut establishing a new abortion legal hotline. Is that correct? What's that hotline going to do, and who's behind it?
Well, basically, the Attorney General, William Tong, is pretty much going to be the point person dealing with the Trump administration. As a matter of fact, the Democratic attorneys general are getting together to try and have some type of unified front to challenge a lot of these proposals from the Trump administration that's anticipated. They're already anticipating a lot of this stuff. And William Tong was Attorney General when Trump was in the first time. So he says they have quite a bit of experience dealing with this. And so what's going on with the hotline is that it's really set up to help people from out of state who are seeking to come to Connecticut, and it will connect them with providers here, and it will also be able to tell them, give them pretty much what the legal layout of pretty much the regulations and what they can and do if they get to Connecticut, and so basically linking people who are seeking services with providers and making sure that the providers understand what the law is.
888-720-9677, the number to call if you'd like to join in and talk to us today, maybe about some Trump policies that you're concerned with, maybe that you support, maybe you voted for Donald Trump, maybe you voted for Kamala Harris, maybe you stayed out of the race. We want to hear your opinions, including one from Robin from Woodbury. Robin, go ahead. We want to hear from you today on the Wheelhouse. Thank you for calling in.
Yes, hi. So we know that Washington is going to step back on climate, and I guess my question would be to panelists, do we think that Harvard will step up? Because we've seen lots of activities in New York State as well as in Massachusetts, but Connecticut seems to be falling behind. I mean, if we're going to take action on climate, it's going to have to be states stepping up now since we know Washington won't.
Alex, John, Ebong, thank you so much, Robin, for calling in. One of you want to take that. I want to point out beforehand, and maybe this will be the pivot point. Right away, you saw pretty much after the election was done, Governor Ned Lamont saying, we're going to ditch plans to try to go, I think, carbon neutral by 2035. Go ahead, Ebong.
Yeah, the EV mandate was off the table.
The EV mandate was off the table, yes.
Yeah. And basically, I've spoken with the governor a couple of times since the election, and he seems to have a wait-and-see kind of attitude that it's not going to be as bad as we might anticipate because it's going to be difficult to do a lot of the things that are being proposed. For instance, getting rid of the Department of Education. Well, we know that Linda McMahon has just been nominated for Secretary of Education. And, she has a history with education in Connecticut. But what they're saying is that they're going to push a lot of this stuff to the states. So what the governor is more concerned about is Medicaid and the fact that we've expanded Medicaid in the state, and we might have to carry a bigger share of that if there's cutbacks from on the federal level. And basically, what he says is he's not up for. If you notice, in California they're having a special session. In Illinois, the governor is really taking a strong stand. Lamont still seems to be holding back a little bit. He's not at the forefront of this, but at the same time, he says we've dealt with this before. We have a track record here, and we're prepared. And we'll see how that goes. Mm-hmm. But it's going to be a tough session, this next legislative session, because the fact that the budget and there's going to be a lot of pressure to get rid of some of the guardrails in order to be able to make up some of the funding we might be losing from the federal government.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You're listening to reporters Ebong Udama, John Moritz, and Alex Putterman. Coming up, we're going to continue our conversation on what 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House could potentially mean for Connecticut's residents. Plus, we'll talk about some of Trump's most controversial cabinet picks. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, we're taking a look at how Donald Trump's policies might impact Connecticut's residents and also diving into Trump's cabinet picks. So it's a good time to give you a heads up. We'll be discussing allegations of sexual misconduct ahead. Joined by Alex Putterman and John Moritz, reporters at CT Insider, as well as Ebong Udama, senior political reporter for WSHU. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Alex, Governor Ned Lamont will likely...
Frankie, I'd just like to...
go ahead, Ebong.
I have, for full disclosure, we're talking about cabinet picks. Linda McMahon served on the board of Sacred Heart University for many years, and Sacred Heart University is a licensee of WSHU. I'd just like to let that.
Yes, and she was a former guest on a Connecticut Public Television sports program that I produced, and she was very happy to come on that program when she was at SHU. But Ebong, as you may know, wasn't very friendly to the media last time around when she was in the Trump administration. I remember Susan Raff having to talk to her, a colleague of ours on the Wheelhouse, trying to get her on camera, and that didn't necessarily happen, Ebong.
She actually had the lowest profile of any cabinet member.
And that's hard to do in that administration, Ebong. Hey, well, let's go to that in a second, but I do want to ask Alex this question. Governor Ned Lamont's going to join us in the Wheelhouse in the next few weeks to talk about the outcome of the presidential election. Governor Lamont has he spoken out about the state's stance on people who identify as transgender? That was a group that Donald Trump slung quite a few attacks at during his campaign for presidency.
Yes. The day after the election, the governor made very clear that he doesn't intend to back down from defending transgender rights. He brought that up. One of the first things he said, to quote, he said, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars mocking kids like this over the last 3 or 4 months. And I'd just like to send a message. Yeah. Here in Connecticut, we love you. We're all God's children. Your friends want to see you in school tomorrow. So, take that for what it's worth. But, certainly Connecticut does not sound like Connecticut will be passing any sort of, dramatic anti-trans legislation like the federal government could consider.
And speaking about healthcare, it's a top concern for Governor Lamont, right? How might the Obamacare system change over the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. Even during the campaign, it was sort of hard to tell exactly whether Republicans want to go through that fight again of trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, or whether, they tried that in 2017, 2018 during the first Trump presidency, and they were not successful. They could give it another go. I think it would, be polarizing. A lot of people get their health insurance through the Affordable Care Act. That would certainly be kind of a seismic impact. 126,000 people in Connecticut alone get health care through the Affordable Care Act. So that would be a giant thing if they were to go after that.
We have another caller into the Wheelhouse this morning. Oh, we love the participation. 888-720-9677, the number to call if you want to get on the line. Jerry from Wyndham, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, Frankie. Nice to talk to you this morning. Actually, Alex and you are talking about things that are directly relevant to myself. I am transgender, and I just recently started my journey, and I have my health insurance through the Affordable Care Act, and my concern is that at present, the medications that I have to take in order to continue my journey are covered, and I'm just I know you said that, Alex, that the governor is concerned and he's put his full behind it. But what actions are we taking in the state legislature to assure that maybe a local Connecticut version of the ACA will help people like myself and others that identify as something other than the sex that they were born?
Alex, before you take that question, let me thank you so much, Jerry, for calling us. And we're thinking about you at this time, Jerry. Thank you so much. Please keep in touch with Connecticut Public. I appreciate your phone call. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I'll just say that's a really good question, and I don't necessarily know the answer. I will say that I think a big story in Connecticut's coming legislative session, which starts in February, is going to be sort of different ways to sort of put up guardrails and protect against things that the Trump administration might try to do that Connecticut's state government might not like. And I think there will be all sorts of proposals around that. My advice to Jerry would be to get in touch with your local legislators and raise that concern. And, for all we know, there could be a law, directly as a result of that advocacy. So that is definitely an interesting issue and something to watch.
Ebong, you already talked about Linda McMahon as one cabinet pick that you wanted to talk about. We only got a couple of minutes left on the show. John, is there one you want to point out here that you're thinking about?
Well, as far as what our senators have said, they've kind of held their fire, so to speak, so far, with one notable exception being Trump's promise to nominate former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz to the position of Attorney General. Our senior U.S. Senator, Dick Blumenthal, sits on the Judiciary Committee, and within hours of that pick being announced last week, he was out vocally saying that he did not think Matt Gaetz met any of the qualifications for the role, and that he'll be voting no. It's probably important to note, it looks like at this point, Republicans will have 53 seats in the Senate, so they can pass any of Trump's cabinet picks without any Democratic support. The key question will be whether they can prevent three of their own side from crossing over and opposing any of these picks.
Ebong, you got about 35 seconds to give me your final thoughts on cabinet picks here before we go to Alex.
I'd just like to mention Lee Zeldin from Long Island, who's the EPA nominee for EPA. And he's been one who's been a big climate change denier. He wasn't that way when he was in Congress and when he used to talk to us. But since the last Trump administration, he stopped talking with us. So it's been hard to get him on the phone. But he's somebody that we're actually...
Ebong is concerned about that. Thank you so much for that. He's also talking about Linda McMahon. Really quickly, Alex.
Yeah, I think we should mention Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's been nominated to lead the Health and Human Services. Vaccine skeptic, has proposed removing fluoride from drinking water. I don't think that will actually happen in Connecticut, but it's something to keep an eye on what he's able to do over there.
Alex, thank you so much. Thank you so much to John and Alex who work at CT Insider. You can see their work at ctinsider.com. And Ebong Udama, senior political reporter at WSHU. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn, edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken. Our technical producer is the maestro Dylan Reyes. If you got time, Connecticut Public has a new 7-part podcast. It's called Generation Barney. Please listen to this podcast. Please subscribe. It's also about the media that shaped us. You can listen on your favorite podcast app at ctpublic.org/Barney. And thank you so much for listening to The Wheelhouse. We'll see you next week.